Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to start and hope that the rest who are outside will join us shortly. The reason I'm starting literally on time is because we've gone a little over with the first session, and so we're going to try and make up some of that time in this one. The question, as most of you have been sort of debating over for 24 hours, is, from what I understand, is really about deconstructing multi-stakeholderism. Who owns the internet? Who runs the internet? And I can tell you, as one of the lay people in this room, to most of the people that I meet outside this room, the answer to that question would be, who cares? But I know it's been a hot topic for all of you here at Cyfy 2014, and in fact for the past 10 years. Also, as a journalist, I have to say that the word itself, multi-stakeholderism, sounds dodgy. It shouldn't even be one word, as somebody just said, a little like the word floxy-noxy-nihili-pihilification. You know, you can look it up online, but you might still not understand exactly what it means. In fact, to quote from John Oliver, the comedian in the US, when he spoke about net neutrality, he essentially said that if you don't want people to agitate about something, about a government decision, don't hide it, talk about it, but wrap it up in so much jargon that nobody will understand it, and it will just go away. And that's probably why every government has been able to achieve this when it comes to the ownership of the internet. We don't see cyber occupy movements on the streets. We don't see cyber springs breaking out. We don't have in India cyber Aam Aadmi Party setting up pickets somewhere. So there's the etymology of the word, there's the geography, and I know that all of us over here have been speaking about, you know, just throwing us around world capitals. You know, Dubai we said this, and Tunis achieved this, and I'm sure we will speak about The Hague and Brazil in the future as well. And then there is that whole idea of the space that multi-stakeholderism holds, and I know one blogger actually called it multi-stakeholder land, as if it's another place at all. The reason I'm saying all of this, you know, the idea of the jargon like community informatics and the nouns that sound like verbs, ICANN as opposed to I can't, and ISOC that sounds like a fighting verb, is not so that I can play the fool. I might actually be a fool on a lot of these issues. But it is because of the reality outside this room and outside the rooms of so many cyber conferences. You know, I'm bolstered by this survey that came out just before this conference that ORF put together, where they asked 250 so-called cyber elites the question, what are the benefits of multi-stakeholderism? And the answer was 73% said the benefits are that all actors get an equal platform. 7% said there are actually no benefits to multi-stakeholderism. And a whopping 20% asked, so what is multi-stakeholderism? I'm going to leave the answer to that really to our speakers. I'm going to hope that we will put aside some of also the euphemisms with which we are talking and that we couch the real meanings of what we're trying to say. Because in a sense, I think that the issues are far deeper. The answer is not, it's about multi-stakeholderism versus multilateralism. It's about our ideas. It's about our imagination. The imagination to relate the concepts of good governance, of representation, of personal rights over the greater good of society to the ether as well. Is the internet a public resource to be distributed like water or clean air, or is it a utility to be charged like power or energy? Is the government of a country the final representative, as many have made the case in the last 24 hours here? Why should the private business sector, that is the biggest user of this resource, have less rights than others? Does the world need another UN for the internet, or perhaps a D20 to go with the G20? Or must countries show that they are truly democratic by engaging all sections of their own society, however small or powerful? All of these are really the powerful ideas that relate to our relations with our government, also with our society and with our world. So I'd like you to welcome our panel. All the names here are people who have not just been heard, they've been read around the world on these issues, and I really must congratulate ORF for putting together this panel. Christopher Painter, he's the coordinator for cyber issues for the State Department there in the United States. Parminderjeet Singh is the executive director for IT for Change in India. He made it very clear he does not speak for the Indian government, but a lot of his ideas are co-simpatico, if I may say, with many of the positions the Indian government has been trying to formulate. Wouter Jurgens is the head of the Cybersecurity Department at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and of course, we're looking forward to the 2015 conference there as well that Dr. Rosenthal spoke at length about. And Alan Marcus is the senior director at the head of Information Technology and Telecommunications Industries at the World Economic Forum, which is going to really take ahead the future from Net Mondial last year. If I could start with you, Chris, you made it very clear that multi-stakeholderism versus multilateralism is not, in fact, a first world versus global south issue. But how do you counter that claim that multi-stakeholderism is just another way of promoting the US's dominance of the internet, not through government, because that's no longer sustainable, but through all its other stakeholders, whether it's the corporates, the funding of the NGOs, and the rest?
So I want to pick up on two of the threads that you mentioned even in your opening. One, is this working?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. One is the fact that you said who runs the internet, and many people say nobody cares as long as it works. And in fact, it has worked, and it has not only worked, but it's flourished in a way that no one could have predicted when it was first created. And it's become such an amazing engine for both economic and social growth around the world. And for instance, in India, as more penetration is happening, that's going to accelerate too. And that's also key to the global south and the developing world, having greater internet penetration, being able to use this technology, strengthen the way we use this technology, but really, we would not have the internet we had today, and we have today, and we would not have this increasing use of the internet and flexibility of the internet if we tried to put, and this was said in some of the talks yesterday by the British minister, if we tried to make this subject to an intergovernmental body that was trying to regulate the internet and figure out where it would go. In fact, we'd all still be using abacuses, I think, somewhere. So we really, that's a key point as we look at it. The other point you made is, 20% of people saying they don't know what multi-stakeholderism means. And I think sometimes what I see in these debates is that people are not really being precise about what they mean, and they're not really even talking about the same things. They're talking past each other. When we talk about inclusive, consensus-based systems, where governments certainly have a role, but so does the private sector, so does civil society, and not just from the US, but from around the world. And indeed, I think that every country should both have, as you mentioned, consultative processes with all their stakeholders, but those stakeholders should participate in these various events. I was at Net Mondial, the big conference that was held in Brazil, and that was just an amazing environment. For any of you that were there, or any of you that watched on the web, or participated through the web, it was incredible to see the vibrancy of that community, which included end users too. It included end users, it included academics, it included civil society, it included industry, it included governments. None of those sectors in themselves are not diverse. They're very diverse sectors. Civil society, you can't say there's one civil society point of view, or one industry point of view, or one government point of view. So having all of them together, I think, led to an outcome document that was much stronger because of that. And including the Global South and many Global South participants endorsing this idea of a multi-stakeholder approach to internet policy, and particularly to the technical running of the internet. Because those people actually understand how the internet works. Now, does that mean that governments have no role? No, absolutely not. Even in that technical running of the internet, the governments are one of the stakeholders, and we talked about this yesterday to some extent. They don't necessarily get the final say, but they have an important role. But when we talk about some other areas, and this is why I think we conflate a lot of terms here, for instance, cybercrime, or some of the international security issues that Uri was talking about, When states are looking at confidence-building measures between states, that's what states, states have the lead in that. When states are talking about passing cybercrime laws, they should absolutely talk to their societies, their civil society, to make sure they balance right between security and privacy. They should be talking to their private sector. Even after even when they're enforcing those laws, they very much need a partnership with those entities as they bring the laws forward, because you need to be able to get those folks involved when they're victims of crime and also when they own some of the infrastructure. But states pass the laws. I used to be a prosecutor, a federal prosecutor doing cybercrime cases many, like 20 years ago, and I didn't ask people, can I prosecute? I didn't poll the entire group and say, can I prosecute someone? We prosecuted someone, and that was a state role. So, I think you have to be a little more nuanced in this. It's not that states have no roles. They have different roles depending on what you're talking about. But when we're talking about the core way the internet works and the policy going forward where we're trying to advance this to the rest of the world, states are one stakeholder, but not the only one. And I do think one of our efforts in the US, and we'll talk about this at the panel at 4 o'clock, but one of our key efforts is exactly that, to bring the developing world into the conversation. Through capacity building, we've been focusing on Africa. We've done a number of regional things on cybercrime, cybersecurity, but also bringing the people into the global conversation, because that's absolutely important. It's critical as these countries are getting more connectivity and they're doing really innovative solutions like online banking in Kenya, for instance, and other online platforms, that we make them part of this. So I don't think this is, I've heard this argument that this is just being driven by the US's interest. The recent ICANN announcement and other things, I think, will signal that we really are putting our money where our mouth is. We really believe in the multi-stakeholder system, not because it advantages us, but because we think this is the right bet for the rest of the world, and we think this is led to the technology we have.
All right. But Minder, do you want to answer that? The government has not been cut out of the decision-making process. It is one of the stakeholders. What's the problem?
Okay, I'll start first by that question which you talk about, and later also talk about the lights not working. About who cares, I think it's very important, because if we do not establish the degree of the need for care, then the rest of the talk is not very important. And I think people need to care, because how the internet is governed would determine how the most of our social systems would be in very near future, whether they would be just, fair, equitable or not. Every sector is changing on the back of the internet. Internet is changing health systems, education systems, media, everything. And what kind of media you would get, what kind of health system would you get, what kind of welfare state would you get, depends on what kind of internet you construct today. So it's very, very important. So let's focus on that. And a related question, therefore, is that the governance of internet, therefore, is not a technical issue. Technical issue is a delegated domain. As long as public policy makers don't think it is public policy, technical issues can be determined in a multi-stakeholder fashion by experts or whatever, and that's happening in all areas, not only in the case of the internet. However, we know that internet is changing all social systems, and therefore key public policy issues get implicated. So the issue here is who decides public policy issues. Again, one, public policy issues. We're not talking about technical systems. Second, decides. We're not talking about consultations. So if we focus on what part of governance system we are really talking about here, we can then make sense whether we want some conception of multi-stakeholder or not. Multi-stakeholderism is participatory democracy as long as it is consultations. As long as it's technical governance, yes, specialized knowledge is important. However, when we are talking about decision-making and public policy, to have or to suggest that corporations should have an equal role as governments, and that doesn't therefore means not only have a role, but governments have the role for public policy making, is anti-democratic. This is not participatory democracy. So the test of multi-stakeholderism is whether it is participatory democracy or not. And that the criteria is, does it increase the inclusion of people who otherwise would not get included in decision making, or does it decrease it? And much of multi-stakeholderism as it is practiced is whoever is present takes the decision. And nobody talks about the politics of presence. What are things which govern presence? So it becomes inside the room versus the outside the room. And this is not democratic. And in all these measures, we start talking about that multi-stakeholderism is a problem. I myself, my organization is a practitioner of participatory democracy. We are on the road for right to information. We work in villages for self-governance, the women self-help groups, whether they have access to self-governance bodies or not. That's participatory democracy. And I would challenge people who say that multi-stakeholderism is participatory democracy to have a conference of practitioners and theoreticians of participatory democracy and talk to them whether multi-stakeholderism is participatory democracy or not. And that would be the test, I think.
All right. That's a very important point he's brought up. I mean, if I was to go through this room and just randomly say, okay, multi-stakeholderism, multilateralism, with a show of hands, you know, not everybody is the same. Not everybody has the same sense of responsibility. You've said, Wouter, that Netherlands, in fact, runs on the national philosophy of multi-stakeholderism. But there is a contradiction, because how does this work? How do you say everyone has a voice, but then someone's got to make the decision?
Thank you very much. Is that working? No.
Is that one working?
Is it working? Hello? Yes.
Yeah, it is.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I think it's an interesting point. I said earlier that in fact, the Netherlands is a country based on consensus building in that sense. And we, from that angle, are a living example of multi-stakeholderism. And I think the key point in this, very relevant for this discussion on internet governance, multi-stakeholderism, is how do you get to decision making in a timely manner in order for you to be able to serve the population at large. And in that sense, I also want to take back your earlier point that people don't care, don't know what multi-stakeholderism is. I think that's one of the problems, because people take for granted that the devices that they want to use access the internet and can do the things that they want to do. And they take that for granted, but they forget that there is a whole layer below that is actually making this possible. And so people should take an interest, and if they would, then it would be, I think, a more informed debate about that. But the key point, I think, in that sense of the functioning of the internet is that is the strong point that we should maintain. The technical community and the working of ICANN that we discussed yesterday, those are the things, the good things that we should preserve. The discussion is about how do we improve the governance in such a way that like my colleague just said, represents more the interest of all the people who want to use this. Let me offer two perspectives on this. I think one thing that we should take in mind is that we should ensure that decision making on this and the actual finding of solutions is not hampered by political decision making on how you implement solutions. So there is these two aspects that we should take into account. The second aspect is how do you, if you want to have states to play their role in this whole debate, how do you organize it? Yesterday we spoke about the GAC, that is the body in ICANN that in which states have their say. That's in a way an inner ring in this process. They are in the center of ICANN. The question is whether we should not look at other models that offer in a way lessons from that we could use. I mean, in that sense, the ICRC is an interesting example where you have an outer ring, let's say, of a convention which was agreed by states, but the functioning of the actual organization, the ICRC, is in the center of this ring, if you will, is not influenced by decision making in the outer ring. So there's lessons to be learned, I think. For us in The Hague, we will make sure that we can have this debate and that all the stakeholders are included. So we definitely give room and participation to states, but also to private sector, the technical community, and academia, not only in the conference itself, but also in the run-up in the agenda setting. I think that's key for this debate.
Right, thank you. And thank you all our participants so far for keeping their comments brief, because we do want to get into the Q&A in a bit. Alan, finally to you, take us to the future if you like. You know, we've spoken about what are the other models that are possible and which is the best model. What decides who has legitimacy? Who's the legitimate stakeholder in all of this? Wouter has come up with the other suggestion. I mean, we've already had the ITU, like the UN or the G20. In India, we have the concept of the Divane Arm and the Divane Khas, which I think the concentric circles you were speaking about. As the World Economic Forum really takes forward the Net Mondial achievements to the next stage, what is it that you see in the future?
I suppose what I see in the future is everybody cares. That might be the start. You know, it was interesting when we think in terms of multi-stakeholderism and the recognition that inclusivity, everyone should have a voice. So if we say there are 7 billion people on the planet, how do we get 7 billion voices? Now, in practice, that seems a bit unwieldy. How do you manage 7 billion voices? How do you make decisions? And I think that's a big part of the debate in multi-stakeholderism. But I want to talk a little bit back to this point of who cares. I agree with Parminder. I agree, in fact, with Wouter as well, that we all need to care because we all do have a stake in it. Now, I agree with the point that says, you know, I don't care exactly how my automobile engine runs. I just care that it runs. But I do have a stake that it runs well. I do have a stake that there are bodies that have guaranteed that it's going to be safe, that it's going to deliver what it says it's going to deliver, and it's going to get me from the point I'm at to the point I want to go to. And I think it behooves us to ensure that those systems are in place. And I think one of the challenges we have in a lot of this is the jargon, right? And I find it fascinating on how many cyber conferences there are, how many internet governance forums there are. And what I find most fascinating about it is it's the same people, at all of them, over and over again, talking about the same issues. And you look at that group of people, the internet community, as many of them call it, and it is fully representative in many ways. But what about the rest of the world? I mean, that's a small slither. And if we can't figure out how to get past this jargon and start looking at the rest of the stakeholders, if you will, that do have a stake, then I think we're going to run into some serious challenges on how powerful this amazing tool, this amazing opportunity we have in front of us. People talk about multi-stakeholderism in three groups. Already said that before. You know, there's civil society, or NGOs, as people call them, business and government. In our world, we talk about labor unions. What about their voice? Let's talk about religious organizations. What about their voice? Or arts and their voice? And the notion of people, you know, and their voice. Does civil society represent their voice, or do they represent specific minor interests or special interests? Does government represent people's voice, or do they have a separate voice? So I don't know that we have answers to these questions, but I know that if we don't move this conversation out of the jargon and into more of a strategic dialogue, we're going to miss the opportunity to really set a futuristic state. So are there other examples that we can look at? ICRC, Law of the Sea, I'm sure there are. But I also think we need to recognize that what has been built thus far is really quite unique and may require very unique solutions. And there are really smart people in the world who are not engaged in the debate because they can't get past this language problem. And whether that's in rural India or rural Nigeria, or whether it's the CEO of Audi or Boeing, they're not part of the debate. So how do we get them much more into the debate and look at this as a strategic asset in a strategic conversation? So the Net Mondial initiative that the World Economic Forum launched with our partners in Brazil and ICANN, it starts with thinking about how to build capacity into the impoverished and marginalized places, but then also how to engage at a strategic level leaders, prime ministers, CEOs, particularly not in the internet community. How do we get them as part of this discussion? I hope that will move this a little bit further ahead than where we are today.
And how would you define the stakeholders? of the future? I mean, we've already had one definition of just the main three, I think Dr. Rosenthal said.
I think what the internet has been able to do that many of us believe, and now let's just start to break down the barriers, but it really creates a borderless place. You know, what is an industry? It's hard to tell, right, anymore. Industry lines have blurred. We've been talking about this for a while. It's coming to fruition. Are automobile companies, are they going to become telecom operators with mobile terminals, we call them cars, and an infrastructure and network so that they can communicate to servers? And so these things all start to blur. So what is a stakeholder? Well, anyone who has a stake. And do I need to categorize them? I think is maybe part of our problem. We're debating so much on are all the categories represented instead of actually worried about do we have the right people in the room who can make decisions and move forward and can work with the community at large to ensure that their needs are being addressed.
All right. Chris, why is the ITU not the final answer? I mean, you know, the world works with the UN. Every country is represented by its government. Why doesn't a similar system work really?
So the ITU is a very valuable but very specialized platform that deals with traditional telecommunications. It is at the end of the day, it is governments. It is governments. Yes, there are other stakeholders who are there at the meetings, but they don't get to really make the decisions. It's governments that make the decisions. And so it is not a good platform for a lot of these issues. And in fact, even within the expertise of the ITU, these are mostly people who are communications people or regulators, and not people who deal with human rights issues, with national security issues, with the full sweep of issues that are involved here. So, both because it's not the right folks, but also because it is not as participatory, it is not as multi-stakeholder, just by its own nature. I mean, it serves a very, very valuable function in terms of spectrum, in terms of some of the development work that they do, in terms of getting more access. All of those things are really key things, and increasing access around the world, as you said in the opening, is something that's really important. So they certainly have a role, but putting them in the central role of trying to run the internet just is a mistake. It's not the right place to put it. Again, I think what we also have to think about is we don't really need, and this goes to some of my co-panelists things, we don't need one ring to rule them all. We don't need one giant institution that's going to control everything for the internet. This is a complex space. This is a new space, and we can have various distributed solutions that involve different stakeholder communities, and you can be much more flexible in doing that. The other thing I think it's worth noting, and this goes to something Parminder said, it's great if we have every country in the world with democratically elected governments who are talking all the time to all their stakeholders. That's just not the case. It's just not. I mean, many governments in the world are not. And many governments around the world, or at least there's a core number of governments, who really have a very different view of cyberspace, who are afraid of cyberspace, who believe that the free flow of information that cyberspace enables is a threat to their stability, and they want to control that information. And they talk about information security and not cybersecurity, for instance. And so they want to impose a more governmental control system because they have traditionally used that kind of system to get those controls in place. And you've seen that increasingly in some states around the world.
But I do have to butt in with the obvious counter to that, which is that the world's biggest democracy, the United States, was really caught with its hand in the till when it came to the NSA revelations. And here you saw, in fact, in India, the particular unhappiness was that when the Indian government asked certain private telecom providers to give them information, they said, no, this is against freedom of private rights and all the rest. And then it turned out they were handing all that information over anyway.
So two things on that, and we've talked about this many times before, but we in the United States had a real searching review of our intel collection practices. There are a number of reforms that have been put in place. But the key thing is every country around the world certainly does surveillance to protect their citizens. Nevertheless, what we have, and we've reformed our practices and are coming up with even newer reforms, the key principles that my boss, Secretary Kerry, talked about were having the rule of law, having a proper purpose and, for surveillance, and having transparency and judicial oversight, or oversight. I'd say a lot of countries around the world don't have that kind of process. And so it was good that we had that debate, but let's not use that, and some states have tried to use that debate to say, okay, that's why we need more governmental control of the internet, and they have a very different reason for wanting to do that.
Okay, so you're distinguishing between the greater good defined by one government over another. Praveen, there is this feeling that India has, by taking a position which was almost a dissenting note at Net Mondial, has isolated itself by not defining, it says they want multi-stakeholderism, but it must be a genuine multi-stakeholderism and all the rest of that. Is India in danger by trying to say that the government must be the final arbiter, in danger of isolating itself on this world stage?
Okay, before I come to your question, no, it's working. Yeah. 2 points which Christopher raised. One is the bad actor issue. That there are bad actors in the UN system, and therefore certain things cannot be handed over to the UN system. The problem is there are 2 answers to it. There are bad actors in different areas of policies, and there are different bad actors. There are different bad actors in access to knowledge policies. There are different bad actors on drug policies, whether affordable drugs should be made available or not. But we live with all those bad actors because that's the house set. And UN is a place where things get balanced out. And bad actors cannot be a good excuse against democracy. Second example is like India would say that in our parliament there are certain member of parliaments with questionable backgrounds. That may be true of many democracies as well, but that doesn't go as an argument against parliament being the final lawmaking body. Our job is to figure out how those member of parliaments are good. Our job is to figure out how more countries can become democratic, to support democratic movements. But I think that bad actor argument is self-serving. Second is about ITU, the question you asked about ITU being intergovernmental. When an intergovernmental body can deal with trade regulation, it can deal with IP regulation, it can deal with climate regulation, it can deal with developmental policies. So what is in the internet space that an intergovernmental body becomes bad? Though I have not been a supporter of ITU taking up that role, but then if not ITU, which should do, some people say only infrastructure work, who should take up the role? Because in policy making, it is important for policies to be made and public policy issues to be addressed. And unless you are able to say, okay, ITU shouldn't do it, but probably a new, more multi-stakeholder body should do it, then we can figure out, yes, ITU shouldn't do it. But we need certain resolutions, and it is intergovernmental systems which are dealing with practically every other area of global governance. And I would see that this should therefore be a natural place. You can increase, because keeping in with times, we can have more multi-stakeholder participation. And I always give the example of OECD's internet making body, which has advisory structures of different stakeholders, which advise the interministerial group, which finally sets the policies. And that basically also was India's proposal to the UN, when people came down on it as being multilateral against multi-stakeholders. There's a bit of hypocrisy in OECD making policies by exactly the same model and saying that internet policies mind it. And India is being multilateral and siding with the dark forces. At Net Mondial, the problems were similar because India introduced the word or supported the word democratic multi-stakeholderism, which our group also did. It says that multi-stakeholderism should work within a larger framework of democracy, which I think most people here should support that. And there were a lack of clarity about whether that is what is being meant. There were inclusion of terms like decision-making should take place by consensus. Now, we should recognize that in public policy spaces, not all decision-making can take place by consensus, because there are things which are, unfortunately, zero-sum games. Some people lose and some people gain. And public policy decisions have to finally be made in certain legitimate manners. And they opposed that consensus making. So there were all those kind of issues that India did oppose, because there's a lack of clarity whether multi-stakeholderism becomes the form of public policy decision making or is a form of consultation and participation. And that clarity has been missing in this debate. And I think that was the reason India probably was ambivalent.
Okay. But what I'm glad for is that the euphemisms have been dropped. On our panel here, I know we are running short of time, so I'm going to open this out to questions right now, and then we can come back to more of the debate if we have time. Questions? I see somebody with a hand right at the back. Can we get a mic to her?
My name is Geeta Hariharan. I'm with the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore. I have two questions, one to Mr. Marcus and one to Mr. Painter. My question to Mr. Marcus is, in August this year, the controversial Net Mundial initiative was launched. It's been roundly criticized for not being an inclusive, participatory, democratic process, even though, as you mentioned now, it seeks to be a multi-stakeholder process. So I'd like to ask how the WEF and the initiative members seek to make this an inclusive and democratic process where all stakeholders can have an equal participatory say. My question to Mr. Painter is how debate within the United States has changed after the Net Mundial outcome document was signed in April this year. Thank you.
We were criticized for not being open. But in fact, I would throw the criticism back onto the internet community in this way. Why are we not allowed to propose a platform or a solution to solving some of the challenges that are already being identified both through the IGF and through the Net Mundial event? Working with the very stakeholders that helped create the Net Mundial event, we came up with a proposed solution, and we put it out there for consultation. That is the way one should operate in this space. If we wait until we get everyone's voice heard on what it should be, we'd still be waiting to announce this thing probably 12 to 15 months later. But I think the purpose is to put an idea out there, and then how it operates, what its principle-based approach will be, should be open to everyone. And we'll see this in the next couple weeks when netmundial.org goes live and has the ability for anyone to bring ideas and for anyone to drive to a specific solution space. It's always fascinating to me when people say, you're not legitimate, when in fact the minute you ask such a question, you're assuming that you are legitimate enough to ask me that question. And we have to be very careful not to
We need a multi-stakeholderism model for discussing the multi-stakeholderism.
we have to be careful not to start excluding people's ideas just because it didn't follow that particular pattern or another particular pattern. If the notion of inclusivity means everyone is entitled to a good idea, then let everyone, including multilateral organizations, including executive committees of enterprises, anyone come up with a good idea.
All right. And you.
Yeah. So a couple things. One, just as an aside, I would recommend people look at the report that was headed by President Ilves of Estonia, where a group came together, a multi-stakeholder group, and talked about some of the ways forward in terms of thinking about various decentralized decision-making, how you might identify solutions that are already there. And frankly, I sort of disagree with Alan saying that you see the same people at all the conferences. I go to various different things that have different communities, the economic community, the security community, the human rights community, the Freedom Online Coalition, for instance, and they're not the same people. They're often even using different language. And so bringing those groups together, I think, is critically important, those different stakeholders together, to understand it. And that's something that the Hague Conference and the prior conferences have tried to do, and I think very successfully. As far as how the Net Mundial document and the outcome has affected the debate in the United States, I think it goes back to your opening. I think more and more people are understanding that even though they just want to see their devices work, that they're beginning to understand that if we don't really make sure that we strengthen the systems we have, but continue to make them inclusive, and to use the term multi-stakeholder, which was one of the key, in fact, the key output from the Net Mundial document, an endorsement, not just by the developed world, but by many members of the Global South, that this is the way to go. that has sparked, I think, more debate outside those normal circles in the U.S. More people are understanding, more people in the banking sector, in the manufacturing sector, and ordinary citizens are beginning to understand, okay, this is a really important thing. And, you know, I was very happy with the Net Mundial document. I thought that really was not just a great result, but it was a great result in the way it came about. And I think that people saw that and said, well, this is really interesting. This really was an interesting conference, and we really want to participate more in these discussions.
All right. I hope you got your answer. Go ahead.
Sunil Abraham. I work with Geeta at the Center for Internet and Society. I was deeply disappointed with the Net Mundial outcome document. If we compare the Chinese censorship and surveillance to US censorship and surveillance, China censors the internet for its citizens and it surveils its citizens, while the US censors the internet for the whole world and surveils the whole world. And the Net Mundial document is the first international soft norm that sanctifies blanket surveillance. The US practices blanket surveillance, unlike countries like India that practices targeted surveillance. And the Net Mundial document says, as long as you follow the rule of law, blanket surveillance is fine. So it is clear to me, at least, that the multi-stakeholder model cannot be used to defend and enforce human rights. Thank you.
All right. That's a fairly powerful comment.
I should comment, and I should have said this initially, you know, we've also been incredibly clear, the president on down, that we do not, like some other repressive states, and many repressive states, use any of the intelligence gathering which is used for purposes, and this is one of the things the president said, you know, for proper purposes. It's never used to target citizens for their dissenting views. It's never used to target religious preferences or sexual or other preferences. It's not trying to control ideas, as it is in many of the repressive regimes where they're trying to control information. I just think that that's worth
you need to make that comment. Wouter, I do want you to come in because you do, in a sense, represent the government as well there in the Netherlands. This whole concept of the double standard, whether we're talking about international interventions, whether we're speaking about cyber issues, and all the rest just keeps coming up. Why is it that the West thinks it's okay if those tools stay in its hands, whereas they are not okay in anybody else's hands?
Well, I think I'm going to have to side with Chris on this because I think it's actually...
We're clubbing you together, which is the
No, I think it hampers actually the debate about a very fundamental thing that should be of interest to everybody around the world, meaning the functioning of the internet and the way it is governed. I think the issue of mass surveillance or bulk collection, whatever you want to call it, is something that is being addressed by the US government. You may or may not agree with what they are putting out, but I think it should not stop us from having a debate about internet governance and about multi-stakeholderism. I think that democratic societies that are based on market economies have a very clear interest in having a free, open, and secure internet, and that the multi-stakeholder community, as it is now, has helped develop that model into a very successful thing. I know I'm repeating things, but I think the key is to keep that and to find a way to include governments and other actors in this debate. And we shouldn't have the surveillance issue dominate this debate.
So it's part of the dangers, yeah.
See, I think we agree that the question, the answer that we cannot fix who are the bad actors. You know, different people will think they are different bad actors, and therefore we need to go back to processes, legitimate processes. And those legitimate processes brings me to the question of UN kind of systems or India's parliament or respective democratic systems where the systems have their process-related legitimacy. Because otherwise everybody would say the other person is a bad actor and it would always be a difference of view.
But it's not a fact, you know, I think what we're saying is that those systems are good for certain things, even in the policy space, but they really aren't inclusive because a lot of the other governments that are there are not inclusive of all the different stakeholders. And of course the UN serves important, good purposes, but for purposes of some of the things that we really think the multi-stakeholder approach is key to, for instance, the technical running of the internet, you know, I can't imagine how a UN process would really do that.
Exactly, I agree. Actually, I agree to the earlier Waters' suggestion that the Red Cross kind of a thing that, I mean, I've been a great votary that ICANN should keep on doing what it is doing, and it should be legitimized under an international law and say that, yes, these actors should do these things, which therefore they carry on doing, which goes to your point.
And we spend the next 30 years trying to write a treaty for the internet, which ultimately, and treaties again are between governments, so you wouldn't have the stakeholder approach there. And a treaty for what? You know, exactly how does that work?
No, see, it's again with the trade, and I'll finish the original point. The trade, IP, climate change, all are extremely, extremely tough issues. And I don't think internet is a tougher issue than climate change, for instance. And I think it serves some interest that we stop certain kind of global negotiations in some places and not in others. And Ellen, going to your point, it's not about good idea. Everybody, including WF, should be, as a think tank, contributing good ideas. We are looking at the focus of the central point which holds a process together. Should VEF be the central point of holding the process together, which from NetMundial it is trying to do, which is a problem because you use the word of Occupy Internet. And how would Occupy Internet kind of people look at WEF as the central point? I mean,
we get your point. I think it's actually interesting to an outsider that the sheer act of ICANN deciding to give up control has actually led to more problems than less. You know, it's an ICANN of worms, as they would say. I saw some more hands going up. Go ahead. You just mentioned the Red Cross, so it's nice that Mr. Abi can also refer to a different sort of model there.
My name is Atish. I'm from the ICRC. Yesterday, day before, we spoke about a challenge that we have, which is attribution. Say in cyber warfare or cyber attack, attribution, who do you attribute the attack to? Are the stakeholders, whether it's state or non-state, are they ready to work together on defining or identifying the attribution bit? Because the law can exist, but if we don't know who it is, we cannot apply upon anybody. Thank you. I mean, anybody can answer.
So I can start.
We've done it together.
Yeah, I mean, I think attribution is a key issue, but you also have to think about it in two aspects. When I was a former prosecutor, I wanted lots of attribution. I wanted to be able to find exactly who was doing what, and I wanted to find them. But at the same time, you know, perfect attribution actually would change this technology greatly for human rights. So if more repressive regimes could identify everyone who's saying everything and use that to arrest them or to stifle their speech, that would be a real problem. So you have to look at this as not a zero-sum game, or in some ways a zero-sum game. You have to think about what are the different things you're trying to uphold. That said, there's been, I think, a lot of work, both in terms of technical attribution, but you know, we don't have to attribute people just based on electronic forms. When law enforcement does these issues, they look at following money, following other things, just like you do in typical investigations. So it's not just simply looking through the net and finding out where people are. And I think to the larger ICRC point, you know, when we talk about, you know, whether you move to a treaty or not, and I don't think you do, what you need to do in this space, which is still pretty new, I mean, you know, we heard this yesterday, is really start coalescing around norms of behavior, norms of state behavior, for instance. That's what came out of the UN-CTED. There's a lot of work to do there where you think, what are things that states should or shouldn't do? What are things they should cooperate on? There's a lot of work to do there, and I think we'll be talking more about some peacetime norms that the U.S. is thinking about, but also other governments are thinking about.
All right. Wait, do you want to add?
Well, I mean, I was going to say, for sure, in the attribution, in fact, the validation of criminal activity on the net actually is being led more by a private enterprise than it actually is by government, and that's not in any way to suggest that's
it's just
the right
not
answer.
as effective, shall we say?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that that's not true either, right? It's how do we partner better together and create more normative functions, which doesn't necessarily have to lead to treaty or multilateral kind of agreements. It could just be normative functions of how we operate better together. And I think the more we focus on that, the more we talk through that, we actually may come up with solutions that may not require very specific treaties in order to be effective.
I mean, just to give you an example of a norm that goes right to that is a norm where states, if there's activity coming from their state, you know, should be cooperating with other states in investigating those issues and making sure you have a more collaborative and cooperative framework to trace these bad actors.
All right. that's certainly, I don't think we got to the exact specific example of China, but we do have an answer to that question. I want to put out a provocative idea, and this has been part of a big debate inside India. I don't know if Samir Saran is in this room, but he wrote a fascinating paper which actually explained multi-stakeholderism to me better than anything else, where he brought up the point, which is of course a controversial point in India, of how it was believed that foreign-funded NGOs organized and calibrated opposition to various Indian economic ventures, nuclear power plants, coal mines, and all the rest of this. So the question that he put, and I don't know if Samir, do you want to ask the question directly? I mean, who gets the right?
Yeah. So the point I'm making was that I think multi-stakeholderism is unexceptionable. It's the way to go. So I don't think Netherlands is any special when it says it's inbuilt. India is like that too. All policies have to be in a democratic society by consensus. You have to take people along, otherwise policies fail. So what a nation is, and at the end of the day, is a consensus amongst various participants. But I think there are three issues here fundamentally. First, Sunil brought it up last evening. I didn't delve on it because we had this panel today. It was space capture. So you have big corporation, multi-stakeholder, who's a part of the multi-stakeholder environment. You have big NGOs or small NGOs funded by that same big corporation, who's also part of the multi-stakeholder environment. And you have big governments who are very fond of those big corporations and those big NGOs, who are also part of the multi-stakeholder environment. So one is space capture, and I don't think you should throw the baby out with the bathwater. Multi-stakeholder should be reformed. And I think it's a process, it's an evolutionary process. So that's one issue with the current format. There are genuine grievances that people are left out, and we had a big public spat in India over the past 6 to 8 months on who represents various segments of society at these particular forums. The second issue here is on intervention. Now, I'm completely uncomfortable when suddenly, because we are all connected on the internet, means that we should all have the same values. We are all, sitting in India, which is loud and sometimes obnoxious democracy, it doesn't mean that I should expect the Saudis to be like this. And the Saudis may have their own way of conducting their political system. So why should different regimes be responding to different sets of inputs? And why do we believe that because they feel differently, and that is the point again I think someone made here, the illiberal liberals. I think there is just no space for people having different views in multi-stakeholderism. So how multi-stakeholder is it if different viewpoints are not? And that's again to your point, that why should WEF be excluded? To exclude WEF means you're defeating the whole purpose of multi-stakeholderism. Right, that's the second issue. And the third issue that really comes is that public policy. A country like India has to be engaging on providing access. We need to give 600 million people access in the next 10 years. We have to give them at price points which are unprecedented. We are strained, we are stressed, we have many other challenges. Why should first world problems be affecting and coloring my third world reality? And sometimes our entire discourse is consumed by the nuance of access rather than providing that basic access itself. And I think that is sometimes it takes away from the space that some of the developing countries need in their public policy. Those are my 3 points. And certainly interventionism is one of them. That you are actually trying to create regime change. You are trying to directly talk to people and throw political systems that have been democratically elected. You're trying to affect those. So are we looking at a new form of digital interventionism when we bypass national governments and start talking to civil societies directly?
All right. I didn't say it, but there's versus and ISIS as a case in point. Chris, is the US and allied countries really guilty of trying to impose values? If a government is good enough for its people, why is it not good enough to represent them?
No, domestically governments should, and particularly India is a democratic government, it's a vibrant democracy. They should have the debate with their stakeholders, just like every government should have, and they should strengthen those. And in the U.S., I'll give you examples. When I was at the White House and doing our international strategy for cyberspace, I did something that was kind of unusual. I went and I talked to the private sector, I talked to think tanks, I talked to civil society and privacy groups. That's not the normal course for things like that, but we did that. And so, but more, and we try to say that countries should do that. We're not prescribing how they do that. Just make sure they get those stakeholders involved. On the international stage, because some countries do have that kind of democratic process, but some don't, a lot of stakeholders are not heard. A lot of the end users are not heard. A lot of the people who understand how the internet works are not heard. Private sector and civil society. So it's important for them to be players there. So there's no intent to impose Western values. The idea is that we think it's not just our value to have an open platform, an open internet, and a secure one, but not at the expense of openness. Have an open, secure, interoperable, unified internet, which is going to benefit the entire world. It's going to benefit their economies and it's going to benefit their societies. That's not a Western value being imposed.
All right. Since the challenge is really for you two gentlemen, you're taking it forward into the next year. When you go into your own conference, Wouter, how are you going to bring these very disparate thoughts? I mean, what Samira has articulated there is a genuine concern. This idea that really all the divides that right now divide the world will also divide the idea of how to govern the internet.
Well, I think the key issue is here that you have to have the different voices represented in the debate. In that sense, maybe pluralism is even more important than multi-stakeholderism. So we are certainly going to have these different voices present in The Hague. We think it is key to look at the different dilemmas in this field. The dilemmas between freedom, security, and economic growth and innovation. I mean, they do offer dilemmas in all kinds of ways, and we've heard a few here. But I think it's important to look at those dilemmas with the different stakeholders present, from the different communities, as I've indicated, but also from different geographical contexts. And we are reaching out to those to different regions as well, on many parts of the debates that we want to have in The Hague, on whether it be on international law and norms, whether it be on capacity building. So we want to make this a broad effort. We've invited over 100 countries. We've invited speakers and participants from the private sector and from civil society, as well as from the technical community. We're also trying to make this link between the technical part of the internet and the policy part, in having a CERT conference that we do annually and link that up with the policy conference so that technical solutions can also be brought to the policy level. It's important that these groups speak to one another. And it's not as if I have the solution. Let's make that very clear. It's a very complicated debate, but we're certainly going to make an effort to contribute to a solution.
Alan, final word to you. Why even try? You've got a great system, or a system, at least that everyone agrees on. Why try? To bring out this individual voice, which may not represent.
Well, so you just made a very big assumption that we have a system that already works. So,
or is in place.
There's a system in place. Does it really work or not is a different question. And maybe even to Samir's point, maybe in fact it's not working, and we need to think past that. But the opportunity to really affect change comes from understanding the various different points. And I think Samir makes a good challenge that says, like, look, if there's a big business that has a particular agenda and they're ensuring government is supporting them because of nationalistic protectionism and trade, and then they fund NGOs to go out and spread the good word, we're not really solving anything. So we really need to understand the various points of the debate. And I think Wouter kind of talked to that. You have to get the different voices. That's different than representation. Right? When we talk about inclusivity and looking at the issues, that's a very different kind of debate. But if we really want to get a debate around ensuring that we're looking at all sides of the equation, we have to think about what those voices represent, and most importantly, what problem are we trying to solve? If we cannot identify the problem, it doesn't matter how inclusive you are. It doesn't matter what voices you have around the table. You're not really making progress. You're just debating for the sake of debating. So if we have real problems identified, we can talk about real solutions and ensure the legitimacy of those solutions come from people who have a stake in that particular issue, which I think goes to the EELS panel and in fact to the Net Mondial principles as well, and the notion of a distributed set of mechanisms that each focus on issues that solve a particular problem.
I think that's an important point to end this discussion on, really, that what we're looking at is not just replicating our conflict resolution systems in any other sphere. But I think what's really come out of this panel, and I really do want to thank all of you for being quite so direct and clear, is that it's about the same values that are core to our interests on every other issue, whether it's democracy, whether it's privacy, freedoms, personal freedoms, law and order, and really the question of the greater good. I think that's as direct a message as I'm going to get on wrapping up this panel. So I'd like to thank you, Alan, Wouter, Chris, and Parvinder for joining us with this. I think we're going to take a short break before the next panel, but I believe it's only 5 minutes. We're still trying to catch up for lost time. Thanks a lot, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.